Hi guys, welcome. Today we aren't just looking at history. We are stepping into a mystery that spans across time and space. Imagine you've just found a dusty ancient compass. One needle points to the silent craters of the moon, while the other spins wildly toward the blood-stained stones of the Roman Colosseum. How are they connected? How did a civilization that built empires on marble end up sending a man to walk among the stars? For the next 3 hours, I'm going to take you through a journey you never saw coming. We will walk through the smoke of the Industrial Revolution, stand in the shadows of great emperors, and witness the birth of a digital future that feels more like a dream than reality. Some stories are told to be remembered. This one is told so you can finally see the world for what it truly is, a beautiful unsolved puzzle. Are you ready to lose yourself in time? Let's begin. The story of Hollywood's golden age does not begin with a red carpet or a flashing camera, but with the scent of orange blossoms and the dry heat of the Southern California sun. In the early 1900s, before the world knew the names of legends, Hollywood was a sleepy religious community that banned the sale of alcohol and frowned upon the theater. However, 1,000 miles away in New Jersey, Thomas Edison held a stranglehold on motion picture patents, charging filmmakers exorbitant fees to use his technology. To escape his legal thugs, independent filmmakers fled west, where the terrain was diverse and the sunlight was eternal. They found a haven where they could film deserts, mountains, and oceans all within a day's drive. By the 1920s, this escape route had become the center of a global empire. The Golden Age is defined by the studio system, a relentless machine of efficiency and glamour where 5 major entities, Paramount, MGM, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and RKO, controlled everything from the initial script to the very theaters where the films were shown. This was the era of the contract player. Actors were not freelancers but assets. A star like Clark Gable or Judy Garland belonged to the studio for 7 years, their public images meticulously crafted by publicity departments that dictated who they married, what they wore, and how they spoke. It was a factory of perfection, but the assembly line produced magic. The transition from silence to sound in 1927 with the jazz singer was the first seismic shift. As Al Jolson uttered the prophetic words, "Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothin' yet," the silent era, the world of Chaplin's slapstick and Valentino's smoldering gazes began to evaporate. Microphones were hidden in flower vases, and actors struggled to maintain their poise while tethered to recording equipment. Some stars faded because their voices didn't match their faces, but others, like Greta Garbo, saw their fame reach celestial heights the moment they spoke. As the 1930s dawned, the United States fell into the grip of the Great Depression. While the rest of the country stood in bread lines, Hollywood became a psychological necessity. For 25 cents, a person could escape the cold reality of poverty and enter a palace of velvet seats and silver screens. The studios responded by creating escapism. This gave birth to the lush, choreographed spectacles of Busby Berkeley, where hundreds of dancers formed kaleidoscopic patterns, and the sophisticated screwball comedies, where fast-talking couples traded barbs in penthouse apartments. It was a time of contradictions. The films were opulent, yet the Hays Code, a strict set of censorship guidelines, was introduced in 1934 to ensure that no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. This forced filmmakers to become masters of subtlety. Romance was told through lingering glances and shadows rather than touch, creating a unique visual language of longing that defines the era's aesthetic. By the mid-30s, the monster movie cycle at Universal gave us Dracula and Frankenstein, tapping into the collective fears of the era, while Walt Disney was quietly proving that animation could carry the emotional weight of a feature film with Snow White. The technical artistry reached its zenith in 1939, often cited as the greatest year in cinema history. In a single 12-month span, the world witnessed the release of Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Stagecoach. These films utilized the new 3-strip Technicolor process, turning the screen into a vivid, saturated dreamscape. The camera work became fluid, the scores became symphonic, and the storytelling became a sophisticated blend of myth-making and American identity. Hollywood wasn't just making movies anymore. It was exporting a lifestyle, a set of ideals, and a version of the American dream that the entire world began to adopt as its own. Every frame was polished, every lighting setup was designed to make the stars look like gods and goddesses, bathed in a soft focus glow that made the real world outside seem dull by comparison. This was the peak of the system's power, a time when the studio heads, men like Louis B. Mayer and Jack Warner, were more powerful than politicians, and the flicker of the projector was the heartbeat of a nation. As the world moved into the 1940s, the shimmering fantasy of Hollywood had to confront a harsh and encroaching reality. The outbreak of World War II transformed the Dream Factory into a vital gear in the American war machine. The transition was seamless yet profound. The same studios that had spent the previous decade perfecting romantic escapism now pivoted to produce documentaries, training films, and star-studded features designed to boost national morale. This era saw the rise of the combat film, but more importantly it saw the birth of film noir, a genre characterized by cynical heroes, femme fatale, and stark, high-contrast shadows. This dark turn in cinema reflected the growing anxiety of a world at war. No longer were the streets of Hollywood films paved with gold, instead they were rain-slicked and dimly lit, mirroring the moral ambiguity of the time. Legendary directors like Billy Wilder and John Huston pushed the boundaries of the Hays Code, using subtext and atmosphere to tell stories of greed, betrayal, and obsession. It was during these years that Humphrey Bogart became the ultimate icon of the era, his weary eyes and trench coat in Casablanca embodying a world that had lost its innocence. Yet, even amidst the shadows of noir, the 1940s remained a period of immense technical and narrative growth. Orson Welles, a young wunderkind from the theater, shattered the traditional rules of filmmaking with Citizen Kane in 1941. By using deep-focus photography, nonlinear storytelling, and innovative sound design, Welles proved that a film could be a complex work of high art, not just a product of a studio assembly line. This period also saw the pin-up era, where stars like Rita Hayworth and Betty Grable became symbols of hope for soldiers overseas, their images plastered on the noses of bomber planes and in the lockers of barracks. Following the Allied victory in 1945, Hollywood entered a brief but glorious Indian summer. The soldiers returned home, and for a few years the box office reached unprecedented heights. However, the seeds of the Golden Age's destruction were already being sown. Two major threats emerged that would eventually dismantle the studio's iron grip: the Paramount Decree and the advent of television. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that the major studios could no longer own their own theater chains. This divestiture broke the monopoly of the studio system. Suddenly, the Big Five had to compete for screen space like everyone else, and the guaranteed profit of their factory-style production evaporated. Simultaneously, a small glowing box began appearing in American living rooms. Television offered free entertainment at home, and the movie-going habit, once a weekly ritual for millions, started to decline. Hollywood's response was, bigger is better. To lure audiences away from their small black-and-white TV sets, the studios invested in massive widescreen spectacles and sword and sandal epics. Technologies like CinemaScope, VistaVision, and 3D were introduced to create an experience that television simply couldn't replicate. This was the era of Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments, films of such staggering scale that they required tens of thousands of extras and sets that stretched for miles. This was also the age of the method, where actors like Marlon Brando and James Dean brought a raw, gritty realism to the screen, clashing with the polished, manufactured performances of the previous generation. The 1950s felt like a beautiful, desperate gasp of air, while the glamour was still there, epitomized by the blonde brilliance of Marilyn Monroe and the regal grace of Audrey Hepburn. The foundation was cracking. Independent producers started to gain power, and the old-school studio moguls found themselves out of touch with a new, younger audience that wanted more than just happy endings. The glitz of the Golden Age was slowly giving way to the revolutionary new Hollywood of the 60s, but not before leaving behind a legacy of films that would define the visual language of the 20th century. The twilight of the Golden Age arrived not with a sudden crash, but with a slow, elegant fading of the light, as the industry struggled to reconcile its conservative roots with a rapidly changing world. By the early 1960s, the rigid walls of the Hays Code, which had dictated the morality of American screens for decades, were finally crumbling under the weight of artistic ambition and social revolution. Audiences were no longer satisfied with the sanitized version of life that the old moguls provided. They wanted the truth, and they wanted it with the raw intensity of the real world. This period saw the final grand gestures of the old studio system, such as the 1963 production of Cleopatra, which nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox and signaled that the era of uncontrolled bloated studio spending was coming to an end. At the same time, a new breed of filmmakers, influenced by European art house cinema and the French New Wave, began to infiltrate the Hollywood hills. These movie brats, directors like Coppola, Scorsese, and Spielberg, were not studio employees. They were auteurs who viewed the camera as a pen. The transition was marked by landmark films like The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde, which broke every unspoken rule of the Golden Age by embracing ambiguity, violence, and sexual frankness. The old guard, men like Louis B. Mayer and Darryl F. Zanuck, who had built the industry from nothing in the dirt of California, were either passing away or being forced out of their own boardrooms by corporate conglomerates that viewed movies as content rather than dreams. Yet, as the physical structures of the Golden Age dissolved, its soul became immortal. The star system may have changed, but the archetypes created by the studios, the rugged individualist, the witty socialite, the tragic hero, remained the DNA of every character that followed. The technical innovations pioneered during this period, from the three-act structure to the mastery of lighting and composition, became the global standard for visual storytelling. Even today, every time a director uses a dolly zoom, or a composer uses a sweeping orchestral motif, they are echoing the innovations of the 1930s and 40s. The legacy of the Golden Age lives on in the preservation of the films themselves. The flickering ghosts of Judy Garland, Cary Grant, and Bette Davis continue to haunt our collective imagination, reminding us of a time when the world seemed simpler because it was captured in the perfect silver light of a studio lamp. The era ended when the studios lost their monopoly, but the Hollywood that exists in our minds, the place of infinite possibility and stardust, is the one created during those 40 years of concentrated magic. As we look back, we realize that the Golden Age wasn't just a period of history. It was the birth of a new human mythology, a universal language that bridged cultures and generations, proving that while empires fall and technologies change, our need to sit together in the dark and be told a beautiful story is eternal. The curtain finally fell on the old system, but the echoes of its applause still resonate in every cinema across the globe, a testament to the men and women who turned a lemon grove into the center of the universe. The story of Hollywood is not merely a history of film. It is a history of the American soul, a sprawling saga of immigrants, inventors, and outlaws who sought to capture the wind and turn it into light. At the turn of the 20th century, the world was a fractured place, and the moving image was nothing more than a flickering curiosity in penny arcades and vaudeville tents. But in a dusty corner of Los Angeles, a transformation was brewing that would redefine human consciousness. To understand the Golden Age, one must first understand the geography of greed. In the early 1900s, Thomas Edison and his motion picture patents company held a legal iron grip on the East Coast, enforcing their patents with a brutality that forced independent filmmakers to look toward the horizon. They fled New York's gray skies and heavy taxes, traveling across the vast American plains until they reached a Mediterranean-like paradise called Hollywood. It was a place where the sun shone 300 days a year, where the labor was cheap, and where the diverse landscape offered deserts, snowy peaks, and rugged coastlines all within a few miles of each other. This was the Wild West of cinema, a lawless frontier where a man with a camera and a dream could build an empire before the lawyers could catch up. The pioneers were often Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, men like Adolf Zukor, William Fox, and the Warner Brothers, who possessed an uncanny intuition for what the masses desired. They understood that cinema was the new universal language, a way for the millions of new immigrants landing on American shores to understand their new home without needing a single word of English. By 1915, with the release of D.W. Griffith's technically revolutionary yet morally controversial The Birth of a Nation, the feature film was born, and the scale of the industry exploded. Hollywood was no longer a collection of barn-turned studios, it was becoming a sprawling industrial complex. The 1920s roared in with a sense of reckless abandon, and Hollywood was its beating heart. This was the era of the silent giants. Figures like Charlie Chaplin, the Little Tramp, became the most famous human beings on the planet, his comedy transcending borders because his pathos was universal. Beside him stood Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart. A woman who was not only a gifted actress but a shrewd business mogul who co-founded United Artists to wrest control away from the suits. Then there was Douglas Fairbanks, the swashbuckling hero who defined masculinity for a generation, and Rudolph Valentino, the Latin lover, whose premature death caused mass hysteria among women worldwide. These were not just actors. They were the first true celebrities, living in palatial estates like Pickfair, their every move documented by a growing army of gossip columnists. The production process during this time was a marvel of silent storytelling. Without dialogue, filmmakers had to rely on the grammar of the lens, the close-up to show emotion, the long shot to show scale, and the intertitle to provide context. The sets became more gargantuan, from the towering Babylonian walls of Griffith's Intolerance to the expressionistic jagged shadows of the imported German directors who brought a sense of dark artistry to the sunny California lots. The studio system began to solidify into the Big Five and Little Three, a vertical integration model where the studios owned the talent, the production facilities, and the theater chains. It was a closed loop of profit and creativity. Every week, nearly 100 million Americans, half the population, went to the movies. They sat in movie palaces, opulent theaters designed to look like Egyptian temples or Persian gardens, where ushers wore white gloves and orchestras played live scores. The experience was sacred. But beneath the surface of this silent utopia, a technological storm was brewing. For years, engineers had tried to synchronize sound with image, but the results were often scratchy and disjointed. The industry leaders were terrified of sound. They had invested millions in silent film libraries and stars whose voices might not match their faces. It was the Warner Brothers, then a struggling fourth-tier studio, who took the ultimate gamble. In 1927, they released The Jazz Singer. When Al Jolson spoke his first lines on screen, the vibration of his voice didn't just fill the theater, it shook the foundations of the world. The silent era died in a single night. The talkies had arrived, and with them came a chaotic period of reinvention. The cameras, once mobile and fluid, were now locked in soundproof booths to hide their mechanical whirring. Broadway actors were imported by the trainload because they knew how to project their voices, while silent icons whose accents were too thick or voices too high-pitched found themselves unemployed overnight. This transition was the first great filter of Hollywood, a brutal Darwinian shift that proved only the most adaptable would survive. As the decade drew to a close and the stock market crashed in 1929, Hollywood stood at a crossroads. It was no longer a novelty, it was an essential part of the American identity. The dust had settled on the orange groves, and in its place stood a shimmering city of light, ready to face the Great Depression with the most powerful weapon ever devised: the ability to make people forget their troubles for 90 minutes at a time. The Golden Age was no longer a dream, it was a reality, and the 1930s were about to take that reality and turn it into a legend that would last forever. As the world plunged into the suffocating darkness of the Great Depression, the lights of Hollywood burned brighter than ever, creating a paradox that would define the 1930s as the true heart of the Golden Age. While the American economy lay in ruins and the Hoovervilles of the homeless sprouted across the landscape, the cinema became the nation's secular cathedral, offering a sanctuary of warmth and hope for the price of a few nickels. This was the decade where the studio system perfected its machinery, operating with the cold efficiency of a Ford assembly line, but producing the ethereal beauty of a Renaissance painting. Every morning, thousands of workers, seamstresses, carpenters, pyrotechnicians, and writers, passed through the arched gates of Paramount or the white columns of MGM, contributing to a collective labor that made the impossible look effortless. The 1930s were governed by the Big Five moguls, men who ruled their lots like feudal lords. Louis B. Mayer at MGM famously declared that he dealt in beautiful people and beautiful stories, creating a roster of stars that he claimed were more numerous than the stars in the heavens. This era saw the rise of the glamour aesthetic, the high-key lighting that erased every wrinkle, the Marcel waves of the hair, and the silk gowns that flowed like liquid silver. However, this beauty was guarded by a new and formidable force: the Motion Picture Production Code, or the Hays Code. By 1934, the Catholic Legion of Decency and various civic groups had forced Hollywood to adopt a strict set of moral guidelines to clean up the screen. No longer could a husband and wife be shown in the same bed, no kiss could last longer than 3 seconds, and every villain, no matter how charismatic, had to meet a punishing end. Yet this censorship inadvertently birthed a new kind of creative genius. Filmmakers became masters of the unspoken. Writers like Ben Hecht and Dorothy Parker crafted dialogue so sharp and subtext so rich that audiences understood exactly what was happening behind closed doors without a single rule being broken. This gave rise to the screwball comedy, a genre defined by battle of the sexes wit and slapstick elegance, where stars like Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn engaged in verbal fencing matches that were far more erotic than any physical embrace. While comedy kept the spirits high, a darker strain of storytelling was emerging at Universal Studios. Under the leadership of Carl Laemmle Jr., the studio leaned into the shadows, giving birth to the Universal monsters. Between 1931 and 1935, the world was introduced to Bela Lugosi's Dracula, Boris Karloff's Frankenstein, and The Tragic Bride. These films weren't just about scares. They were reflections of the era's collective trauma. The fear of the other, the anxiety of science gone wrong, and the loneliness of the marginalized. The visual style, heavily influenced by German Expressionism, used jagged shadows and distorted angles to create a nightmare world that felt strangely comforting to a public already living through a real-life nightmare. Simultaneously, the musical was being reinvented by the visionary Busby Berkeley. He moved the camera away from the stage and placed it in the rafters, creating top-down shots of dancing girls that looked like blooming flowers or spinning gears. It was a celebration of geometry and human synchronization, a visual metaphor for the industrial recovery the country so desperately craved. As the mid-30s approached, the technology of storytelling took another leap with the arrival of full-color cinematography. Technicolor was a complex, expensive process that required a massive camera and blindingly bright lights, but when the world saw the vibrant reds and deep blues of the screen, there was no going back. It was during this period that a young, ambitious animator named Walt Disney bet everything on a dream that many called Disney's Folly. He wanted to make a full-length animated feature. When Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered in 1937, it didn't just succeed. It proved that hand-drawn characters could make an audience weep, laugh, and tremble with fear just as effectively as flesh-and-blood actors. The decade reached its absolute crescendo in 1939, a year that many historians consider the pinnacle of human artistic achievement in the medium. It was a year of staggering diversity and scale. From the Technicolor fantasy of The Wizard of Oz, which taught a generation that there's no place like home, to the sprawling, controversial yet breathtaking epic Gone with the Wind, Hollywood was proving that it could capture the entirety of the human experience on a strip of celluloid. At the same time, Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington reminded a cynical public of the power of the individual against corruption, while John Ford's Stagecoach elevated the Western from a B-movie cliché to a serious exploration of American mythology, turning John Wayne into a global icon of rugged stoicism. By the end of 1939, Hollywood was no longer just an industry. It was the dominant cultural force of the Western world. The stars were gods, the directors were maestros, and the studio heads were the architects of a new reality. But as the decade closed and the shadows of a new war began to stretch across Europe, the innocence of the 1930s began to fade. The next chapter would see Hollywood drafted into the most significant conflict in human history, changing the tone of the movies from the dreamlike to the visceral, as the Dream Factory prepared to go to war. As the 1940s dawned, the shimmering veneer of Hollywood's escapism was pierced by the cold steel of global conflict, marking a transition from the Dream Factory to a vital engine of national resolve. The decade began with a world on fire, and for the first time, the secluded hills of California felt the tremors of distant battlefields. Hollywood's initial response was a mix of hesitation and duty, but after the shock of Pearl Harbor, the industry underwent a total mobilization that changed the texture of cinema forever. The studios were no longer just producing entertainment, they were manufacturing morale. The U.S. government established the Office of War Information to coordinate with studio heads, ensuring that every film, whether a musical, a comedy, or a drama, contributed in some way to the war effort. Legendary directors like John Ford, Frank Capra, and John Huston traded their silk scarves for military uniforms, heading to the front lines to film raw, visceral documentaries like The Battle of Midway and Why We Fight. This immersion in reality bled back into the fictional features being made on the home front. The lighting grew grittier, the scripts more somber, and the heroes more flawed. This was the era of the man of action, but also the man of sorrows. Perhaps no film captured this wartime soul better than 1942's Casablanca. What started as a chaotic, troubled production became the definitive statement of the age. A story of a cynical man, Rick Blaine, played by Humphrey Bogart, who discovers that his private pain is secondary to the global struggle for freedom. The film's mix of fog-shrouded romance and political sacrifice mirrored the hearts of millions of soldiers and their families. While the war raged, a young, arrogant genius from the world of radio and theater named Orson Welles arrived in Hollywood with a silver spoon contract from RKO that gave him total creative control, a rarity in the studio system. In 1941, he released Citizen Kane, a film that didn't just tell a story but reinvented the very language of sight and sound. With its deep-focus cinematography, non-linear narrative and ceiling sets, Welles proved that a film could be a psychological labyrinth. Though it was a box-office disappointment at the time due to a smear campaign by newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst, its influence acted as a slow-acting poison that eventually killed the old, simplistic way of making movies. As the mid-40s approached, a new shadow began to fall over the screen: film noir. This wasn't a genre the studios named themselves. It was a mood that emerged from the collective anxiety of the era. Influenced by the hard-boiled detective novels of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, and visually inspired by the stark shadows of German expressionism brought over by fleeing European directors, noir showed the underbelly of the American dream. The 1944 masterpiece Double Indemnity set the blueprint. The rain-slicked streets of Los Angeles, the smoke-filled rooms, the doomed protagonist and the lethal femme fatale, a woman who used her sexuality as a weapon in a world where men were no longer sure of their place. This darkness reflected the internal scars of returning veterans who found that the world they had fought for was not the sunny paradise promised by the 1930s musicals. Simultaneously, the role of women in Hollywood was shifting. With the men away at war, actresses like Bette Davis, Joan Crawford and Barbara Stanwyck took on women's pictures, intense melodramas that explored domestic sacrifice, career ambitions and female resilience. These films, often dismissed as weepies, provided a sophisticated look at the changing social fabric of America. However, as the war ended in 1945, Hollywood faced its most terrifying enemy yet: itself. The internal politics of the United States shifted into the paranoia of the Cold War. The House Un-American Activities Committee (WAC) turned its sights on Hollywood, looking for subversive communist influence among the screenwriters and directors. This led to the infamous blacklist, where talented artists were stripped of their careers and forced into exile or penury, creating a climate of fear that stifled the very creativity that had won the war. At the same time, the technical landscape was shifting. Color was becoming more common, but it couldn't hide the fact that the studio monopoly was under legal threat. The 1948 Paramount Decree was the death knell for the old way of doing business. The Supreme Court ruled that studios could no longer own the theaters that showed their films. This divestiture meant that the guaranteed profit from even a bad movie was gone. For the first time, the Big Five had to compete on quality alone in an open market. As the decade closed, a new invention began to flicker in American living rooms: the television set. Hollywood looked at the small, grainy box with a mixture of contempt and terror, not yet realizing that the Golden Age was entering its final, most spectacular act of desperation. The 1940s had taken Hollywood from the height of its patriotic power to the brink of institutional collapse, leaving behind a body of work that was deeper, darker, and more human than anything that had come before. The 1950s arrived not as a quiet transition, but as a decade of magnificent widescreen desperation, where the Dream Factory found itself besieged by the twin forces of technological progress and shifting social values. This was the era of bigger is better, a time when Hollywood attempted to reclaim its throne from the encroaching glow of the television set by turning the cinema into a sensory experience that no living room could replicate. As millions of American families moved to the suburbs and purchased their first black and white TVs, box office numbers began a terrifying slide, forcing the studios to innovate or perish. Their response was the birth of the widescreen wars. Technologies like CinemaScope, VistaVision, and the short-lived Cinerama expanded the horizon of the screen, offering panoramic vistas that made the audience feel as if they were standing in the middle of a Roman Colosseum or a vast Technicolor desert. This technical gigantism gave rise to the era of the mega-epic. Directors like Cecil B. DeMille and William Wyler crafted films of staggering scale, such as The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur, the latter of which featured a chariot race so complex and dangerous it remains a pinnacle of practical filmmaking to this day. These films weren't just movies. They were events designed to be seen in massive theaters with stereophonic sound that rattled the bones. Yet beneath the weight of these multi-million-dollar spectacles, a more profound revolution was occurring in the art of acting itself. The polished mid-Atlantic theatricality of the 1930s was being swept away by a raw, sweating, and stuttering realism known as the method. Emerging from the actor's studio in New York, performers like Marlon Brando and James Dean brought a jagged emotional honesty to the screen. In 1951's A Streetcar Named Desire, Brando didn't just play a character. He inhabited a primal force of nature, his mumbling delivery and visceral presence shattering the carefully curated star persona of the past. James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause became the brooding face of a new generation. The teenager, a demographic that Hollywood had previously ignored but now realized held the key to its survival. This was a decade of intense contradictions. While the screens grew wider and the colors more saturated, the political atmosphere remained suffocatingly gray. The Red Scare and the Blacklist continued to haunt the studio lots, leading to a period of social problem films that had to disguise their critiques of American society as westerns or science fiction. High Noon, for instance, was a thinly veiled allegory for the cowardice of those who stood by while their neighbors were persecuted by McCarthyism. In the realm of sci-fi, films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers captured the Cold War paranoia of a society losing its individuality to a faceless alien other. Amidst this tension, the legendary Alfred Hitchcock reached the zenith of his powers, crafting a series of psychological thrillers like Rear Window and Vertigo that turned the audience into voyeurs and explored the darker recesses of the male psyche. Hitchcock understood that while the spectacle brought people into the theater, it was the suspense that kept them in their seats. Simultaneously, the musical was being perfected at MGM under the Freed unit, producing masterpieces like Singin' in the Rain, which ironically looked back with nostalgia at the very transition to sound that had birthed the industry's first crisis. As the decade progressed, the iconic blonde bombshell archetype reached its peak in Marilyn Monroe. She was the ultimate product of the studio system, meticulously crafted, hypersexualized, and intensely photographed. Yet her films, like Some Like It Hot, showcased a comedic genius that often transcended the dumb blonde trope she was forced to play. By the late 50s, the star system was in its death throes. Independent stars like Cary Grant began to work without long-term contracts, demanding a percentage of the profits and effectively ending the era of studio ownership. The old moguls, now in their twilight years, watched as the wall of censorship known as the Hays Code began to crack under the pressure of films like Anatomy of a Murder and Psycho, which dared to show blood in a sink and speak of forbidden desires. The 1950s ended with Hollywood standing on the edge of a precipice. It was more technically advanced and visually spectacular than ever before, but it was losing its grip on the cultural zeitgeist. The stage was set for the 1960s, a decade that would witness the final collapse of the old order and the birth of a new Hollywood that would be grittier, bloodier, and more experimental than anything the pioneers of the silent era could have ever imagined. The 1960s dawned as a decade of profound identity crisis for Hollywood, representing the final turbulent chapter of the Golden Age where the ghosts of the past collided violently with the fires of the future. The decade began with a deceptive sense of continuity. The old guard still sat in their velvet-lined offices, and the studios were still betting their fortunes on massive, star-studded musicals and historical epics. However, the cultural landscape of America was shifting beneath their feet like tectonic plates. The civil rights movement, the burgeoning counterculture, and the escalation of the Vietnam War created a generational chasm that the traditional studio formula could no longer bridge. The first major sign of the end was the 1963 production of Cleopatra. It was meant to be the ultimate statement of studio power, starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, but its astronomical budget nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox and proved that the bigger is better philosophy had reached a point of diminishing returns. Audiences were becoming cynical. They no longer saw the artifice of the studio backlit as a dream, but as a lie. At the same time, the rigid morality of the Hays Code was finally being dismantled. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho had already shocked the world by killing off its leading lady in the first act and showing a flushing toilet, a previously forbidden sight. By 1966, the release of Mike Nichols' Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf used profanity and raw domestic brutality that rendered the old censorship rules obsolete, leading to the birth of the MPAA rating system, GMRX, in 1968. This was the moment the Golden Age officially died and New Hollywood was born. The transition was marked by a trio of films in 1967 that signaled a total revolution: The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, and In the Heat of the Night. These films embraced anti-heroes, sexual frankness, and stylized violence, speaking directly to a youth audience that felt alienated by the polished perfection of the 1940s. The old moguls, the men who had built Hollywood from the dirt, were being replaced by corporate conglomerates like Gulf Plus Western and Kinney National Company, who viewed movie studios as mere tax write-offs or real estate assets. The personal touch of the movie czar was gone, replaced by the cold metrics of the boardroom. Yet as the studio system collapsed, it left behind a legacy that would become the foundation of all modern global culture. The Golden Age had created a universal visual language. The grammar of the close-up, the rhythm of the cross-cut, and the mythos of the American hero, that would be inherited by the movie brats of the 70s like Spielberg, Lucas, and Coppola. These new directors were the children of the Golden Age, having grown up watching the very films we have discussed, and they used those tools to build the blockbuster era. As we look back on those 40 years from the late 20s to the late 60s, we see more than just a period of industrial history. We see the creation of a modern mythology. The Golden Age of Hollywood was the era when humanity first learned to dream in public, in the dark, together. It was a time when the flickering of a projector could unite a nation in grief or lift a world in hope. The stars of that era, Bogart, Davis, Gable, Hepburn, Monroe, no longer feel like mere actors. They have become constellations in our collective memory, frozen in a state of eternal silver perfection. The Dream Factory may have closed its gates, and the orange groves of Hollywood may have long since been paved over with concrete and neon, but the magic remains. Every time a camera rolls, every time a light hits a lens, and every time an audience falls silent as the curtains part, the spirit of the Golden Age lives on, reminding us that for a brief, shining moment in the 20th century, we actually caught the light and made it speak. While the stars were the face of the Golden Age, the true power resided in the shadows of the sound stages and the smoke-filled offices of the producers. To understand how Hollywood maintained such a high standard of quality for decades, one must look at the unit production model. Unlike today's fragmented industry, a studio in 1940 was a self-contained universe. If a director needed a 17th-century French village, the studio's backlit carpenters built it within days. If a lead actress needed a gown that looked like starlight, the costume department, led by titans like Edith Head or Adrian, would hand-stitch garments that set global fashion trends the moment the film premiered. This internal synergy created a studio style. You could tell a Paramount film by its European sophistication and sparkling wit, often influenced by the Lubitsch touch. You could recognize a Warner Brothers picture by its gritty urban realism and fast-paced dialogue, mirroring the headlines of the day. And everyone knew an MGM film by its relentless opulence and more stars than there are in the heavens philosophy. But the most vital invisible component was the director. In an era where the studio head had the final word, a handful of auteurs managed to stamp their unique vision onto the celluloid. There was John Ford, the poet of the American West, who used the towering buttes of Monument Valley as a canvas to explore the soul of the frontier. There was Howard Hawks, the master of every genre, who believed that a good movie was 3 great scenes and no bad ones. And then there was the master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock, who manipulated the audience's heart rate with the precision of a watchmaker. These directors were the ones who pushed the technical boundaries, demanding new types of lenses, innovative camera dollies, and complex sound mixing that forced the medium to evolve. However, the perfection seen on screen was often bought with a heavy price in human terms. The star system was a gilded cage. To the public, life for a star like Judy Garland or Montgomery Clift looked like a dream, but behind the scenes it was a grueling regime of pills to keep them awake for 18-hour shoots and pills to help them sleep at night. The fixers, men like MGM's Eddie Mannix, worked around the clock to bury scandals, bribe police, and arrange lavender marriages to protect the moral image required by the Hays Code. This tension between the manufactured purity of the screen and the chaotic reality of the human beings behind it created a psychological pressure cooker that defined the era's private history. Yet, even with these flaws, the level of craftsmanship was unparalleled. The cinematographers, or directors of photography, were painters with light. They developed techniques like Rembrandt lighting to give faces a three-dimensional depth and used soft focus filters to turn actresses into ethereal goddesses. The transition from black and white to Technicolor was not just a change in palette, it was a change in the way stories were felt. The deep, saturated reds of a character's lipstick or the vibrant green of a forest became emotional cues that bypassed the intellect and went straight to the heart. As we peel back the layers of this era, we see that Hollywood's success wasn't an accident. It was a miracle of organization, a moment in time where the greatest artistic minds, the most ambitious businessmen, and the most advanced technology all converged in one zip code. This factory of dreams was the most successful cultural export in history, shaping the way the entire world thought about love, war, justice, and the American identity. It was a world where every frame was a painting, every line of dialogue was a poem, and every ending, no matter how tragic, was beautiful. In this next movement of our epic history, we transition from the internal mechanics of the studio lots to the fierce, fiery human conflicts and the global shockwaves that ensured Hollywood's dominance would never be forgotten. The Golden Age was not merely a place of collaborative harmony. It was a battlefield of egos, where the friction between titans produced the sparks that lit up the silver screen. To understand the era's intensity, one must look at the legendary rivalries that the studios both feared and exploited. Perhaps none was more iconic than the lifelong Cold War between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. Their animosity was a potent mix of professional jealousy and personal disdain, representing two different paths to stardom. Crawford, the quintessential self-made glamour queen who meticulously managed her image, and Davis, the fierce, uncompromising actress's actress who cared more about the craft than the lighting. This rivalry eventually culminated in the 1962 psychological thriller Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, a film that captured their mutual loathing so authentically that it became a meta-commentary on the cruelty of the very industry that had made them queens. These personal wars were mirrored by the industrial rivalries between the studios themselves. Paramount and MGM constantly vied for the title of most prestigious, leading to a prestige arms race, where budgets spiraled and talent was poached in the dark of night. Yet while Hollywood was busy fighting its internal battles, it was also becoming the most powerful diplomatic tool in the American arsenal. During the 1940s and 50s, the Hollywood version of life, with its white picket fences, fast cars, and moral certainty, was being exported to a war-torn Europe and an awakening Asia. The world didn't just watch American movies. They began to dress like Cary Grant, walk like Grace Kelly, and dream of a California that didn't actually exist. This global influence gave rise to a fascinating cross-pollination. European directors, fleeing the rise of fascism, brought the moody intellectual aesthetics of German expressionism and French poetic realism to the sunny streets of Los Angeles, creating the dark, cynical beauty of film noir. Without the influence of these outsiders, Hollywood might have remained a superficial factory of happy endings. Instead, it became a complex tapestry of global artistry. As the 1960s approached, a new kind of rivalry emerged, not between actors but between generations. The old Hollywood of the moguls was being challenged by the new Hollywood of the movie brats. These were the first filmmakers who had actually studied film as an academic discipline. They didn't view movies as a business product, but as a revolutionary medium. This tension reached a breaking point when the old-school musical Dr. Dolittle was nominated for Best Picture alongside the counterculture masterpiece The Graduate. The industry was at a crossroads: stay with the safe, bloated traditions of the past, or dive headfirst into the messy, violent, and honest future. The legacy of the Golden Age, however, is not found in who won those specific battles, but in the fact that the battles were worth fighting. It was an era that proved cinema could be both a massive commercial industry and a profound art form simultaneously. The structures built by the pioneers, the pacing of a thriller, the soaring emotional arc of a romance, the heroic journey of the Western, became the universal templates for storytelling. Even as the physical studios began to decay and the contract system was abolished, the Golden Age remained the North Star for every filmmaker who followed. It was a period of concentrated lightning, a 40-year storm of creativity that redefined what it meant to be a human being in the age of the image. As the dust of the 1960s revolution settled, the final transformation of the Golden Age began, shifting from a physical reality of studio lots and ironclad contracts into a permanent spiritual foundation for everything we now call cinema. To understand this final evolution, we must look at the unsung heroes, the writers and editors who functioned as the central nervous system of the Dream Factory. In the peak of the Golden Age, the writers' building at a studio like MGM was a high-pressure greenhouse where some of the greatest literary minds of the century, from F. Scott Fitzgerald to William Faulkner, were kept on weekly retainers. They were often treated like high-priced stenographers by the moguls, yet it was their ability to craft the Hollywood line, that perfect, snappy, rhythmic dialogue, that gave the era its soul. A movie wasn't just a series of images, it was a symphony of words. This was the age of the screenplay as architecture, where scripts were constructed with a mathematical precision that guaranteed an emotional payoff every 20 minutes. While the writers provided the blueprint, the editors were the secret magicians in the dark. In the Golden Age, editing was often seen as women's work, leading to a generation of legendary female editors like Margaret Booth and Barbara MacLean, who literally defined the invisible style of Hollywood. They mastered the art of the continuity cut, ensuring that the audience never noticed the transition from one shot to another, creating a seamless, dreamlike flow that made the viewers forget they were watching a manufactured product. This seamlessness was the hallmark of the era. The goal was never to show off the camera, but to make the camera disappear into the story. But as the 1970s arrived, the new Hollywood rebels, the sons and daughters of the Golden Age, took these very tools and turned them inside out. Directors like Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese didn't want the camera to be invisible, they wanted it to be a witness. They took the lighting techniques of film noir and the scale of the 1950s epics and applied them to the gritty, unwashed streets of New York and the moral decay of the post-Vietnam era. This was the new Golden Age, a period where the craftsmanship of the old world met the brutal honesty of the new. The transition was perfectly symbolized by The Godfather, a film that utilized the grand operatic scale of the old studio system to tell a story that was deeply personal, violent, and cinematically revolutionary. This era proved that the Golden Age hadn't really ended. It had simply evolved, shedding its skin of censorship and studio control to become a more mature, dangerous art form. Even the concept of the star changed. No longer were they polished, untouchable gods. Now they were everymen like Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman, who brought a neurotic, relatable energy to the screen. Yet despite this shift toward realism, the industry eventually circled back to the sense of wonder that had birthed it in the first place. In 1977, when George Lucas released Star Wars, he used the swashbuckling tropes of Douglas Fairbanks and the serial adventure pacing of the 1930s to create a new mythology for a new generation. It was the ultimate tribute to the Golden Age, a film that looked to the future while being deeply rooted in the storytelling traditions of the past. Today, as we navigate an era of digital effects and streaming platforms, the Golden Age remains our primary reference point. We still use the three-act structure perfected in the 30s, we still use the Rembrandt lighting developed in the 40s, and we still chase that elusive movie magic that can only be found when a group of strangers sits together in the dark to share a dream. The Golden Age was the moment when humanity mastered the art of the collective imagination. It was a 40-year miracle that taught us how to see, how to feel, and how to believe in the impossible. The studios may be owned by tech giants now, and the film may have been replaced by sensors and pixels, but the flickering heart of Hollywood remains the same, a relentless, beautiful pursuit of that one perfect frame that can change a person's life forever. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Golden Age, we must pause at the year 1939, a temporal anomaly where the alignment of talent, technology, and economic necessity created a surge of creative output that has never been equaled in the history of human art. This was the year that Hollywood, having survived the Great Depression and mastered the transition to sound, reached its absolute zenith. In this single 12-month span, the studio system functioned with the divine precision of a Swiss watch, producing a library of films that would serve as the DNA for all global storytelling to follow. At the center of this storm was the production of Gone with the Wind, a film so massive and troubled that it became a metaphor for the industry's own hubris and ambition. With 3 different directors, a nationwide search for its lead actress, Scarlett O'Hara, and a budget that defied logic, it was the ultimate test of the producer-led system. When the burning of Atlanta lit up the Technicolor screen, it wasn't just a scene. It was a declaration that cinema had finally surpassed the scale of the theater and the intimacy of the novel. Simultaneously, 1939 gave us The Wizard of Oz, a film that utilized the sepia-to-color transition to mirror the very journey of the audience, leaving the gray, dusty reality of the Depression for a world of saturated primary colors. These 2 films alone would have made the year legendary, but the assembly line of the Golden Age did not stop there. This was also the year of Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which dared to question the sanctity of American politics, and John Ford's Stagecoach, which fundamentally elevated the Western from a B-grade distraction to a serious cinematic exploration of social class and frontier justice. It was the year Greta Garbo finally laughed in Ninotchka, the year Laurence Olivier became a haunted icon in Wuthering Heights, and the year Bette Davis gave a masterclass in tragedy in Dark Victory. But what made 1939 truly the greatest year was the labor force behind the curtain, the thousands of anonymous craftsmen who made this volume of perfection possible. Underneath the glamour was a world of below-the-line workers. The scenic painters who could recreate London in a Burbank parking lot, the Foley artists who invented sounds for things that didn't exist, and the script girls who maintained continuity in a world of chaos. These workers were the backbone of the guilds and unions, which began to rise in the late 30s to fight for the rights of the people who actually built the dreams. The struggle between the ruthless studio moguls and the burgeoning labor movements added a layer of gritty real-world drama to the industry's history. It was a time of intense strikes and backroom deals that ensured the Golden Age was not just a period of artistic flourish, but also a crucible for modern labor rights in the arts. As the decade closed, the industry was a paradox of extreme opulence and hard-fought industrialism. The films of 1939 captured a world on the brink of profound change. They were the last artifacts of a global innocence that would be shattered by the coming of the Second World War. When we watch a film from that year today, we aren't just seeing a movie. We are seeing the peak of a civilization's visual capability, a moment where everything that could go right in the process of creation actually did. It remains the yardstick by which every subsequent era of Hollywood is measured, a testament to what happens when a factory of dreams decides to stop making products and starts making immortality. In this next expansive movement of our epic history, we pull back the velvet curtain to reveal the most poignant and fragile component of the Golden Age: the child stars and the transformation of Hollywood into a global geopolitical weapon. To understand the Dream Factory in its entirety, one must look at those who grew up within its steel and glass machinery, children who were not merely actors but biological assets of the major studios. Figures like Shirley Temple, Mickey Rooney, and Judy Garland were the emotional anchors of a nation. During the darkest days of the 1930s, Shirley Temple's bouncing curls and relentless optimism were credited by President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself for helping America whistle through the Great Depression. She was the top box office drawer in the world, a child whose image was licensed for dolls, dresses, and cereal, yet behind the camera, she was a professional expected to memorize lines and hit marks with the precision of a veteran. This era saw the studio system at its most paternalistic and most predatory. The case of Judy Garland at MGM remains the most haunting example of this duality. To the public, she was Dorothy Gale, the girl next door with the voice of an angel. To the studio, she was a product that needed to be maintained. To keep her weight down and her energy up for the grueling 18-hour shifts on films like The Wizard of Oz and the Andy Hardy series, she was fed a cycle of amphetamines and barbiturates, a chemical leash that would tragically define her life. Mickey Rooney, her frequent co-star, was the energy king of the lot, a teenager who embodied the restless, booming spirit of American youth, yet he too was a prisoner of the contract system, married off and managed by publicity departments that cared more about his boy-next-door brand than his personal stability. These children were the foot soldiers in Hollywood's first attempt at soft power. As they grew, the industry around them was being drafted into a much larger struggle. Following the end of World War II, as the 1940s bled into the 1950s, Hollywood became the primary architect of the American way of life in the burgeoning Cold War. The United States government realized that movies were more effective than missiles in the fight against Soviet ideology. The Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild Europe, often came with stipulations that American films must be shown in foreign theaters. This was the celluloid conquest. Every frame of a Hollywood film, showing a refrigerator full of food, a shiny new Ford, or a woman with the freedom to choose her own destiny, was a targeted strike against the austerity of the Iron Curtain. This geopolitical role forced the studios into a state of hyperconformity. The Red Scare wasn't just about finding spies, it was about ensuring that the American image remained pure for export. This led to the tragic blacklist, where the industry's most brilliant writers were forced to write under pseudonyms or flee the country, their careers sacrificed on the altar of national image. Yet, even under this immense political pressure, the artistry continued to evolve. The 1950s saw the rise of the international co-production. To lower costs and expand their reach, studios began filming in Rome's Cinecittà, often called Hollywood on the Tiber, and London's Pinewood Studios. This globalization brought a new, sophisticated flavor to the Golden Age. Films like Roman Holiday introduced the world to Audrey Hepburn, a star who represented a new kind of global aristocracy, chic, multilingual, and ethereal. The rugged, isolated Americana of the 30s was being replaced by a cosmopolitan elegance. At the same time, the Western genre was being deconstructed by directors like John Ford and Anthony Mann. They began to show the dark side of the sun, portraying the frontier not as a place of simple heroism, but as a landscape of psychological trauma and racial tension. This was a reflection of an America that was finally beginning to look in the mirror and question its own myths. The Golden Age was no longer just a factory, it was a complex, contradictory mirror of a superpower in transition. By the end of this era, Hollywood had successfully branded the world. From the streets of Tokyo to the cafes of Paris, the icons of the Golden Age, the cowboy, the detective, the starlet, had become the new gods of a secular age. The children who had started the decade as mascots had either burned out or transformed into the weary, wise legends of the next generation, proving that while the dream was manufactured, the cost of producing it was very, very real. In this final high-definition expansion of our epic, we peel back the shimmering layers of the manufactured image to examine the secret language of the wardrobe and the dark architecture of the studio scandal. This is where the physical meets the psychological, showing how the Golden Age maintained its grip on the world's imagination by controlling every stitch of fabric and every headline in the morning paper. To understand the visual power of this era, one must realize that the costume designers, titans like Edith Head at Paramount and Adrian at MGM, were not just dressmakers, they were the primary enforcers of the star persona. In an era of strict censorship under the Hays Code, the wardrobe became a subversive tool for storytelling. Since directors could not show skin or explicit intimacy, they used the texture of the fabric to convey character. A femme fatale was draped in liquid lame that caught every glint of light, making her look like a dangerous, shimmering predator. A good girl was dressed in stiff cottons and high collars to signify her moral rigidity. Designers even invented the stark contrast look for black and white film, using specific shades of pink and green that would translate into the perfect luminous shades of gray on screen. This was a world where a single gown could cost more than a suburban house, and where stars like Marlene Dietrich would endure 8-hour fittings to ensure a dress hit the light at the exact angle to hide a perceived flaw. However, the perfection of the wardrobe was often a shroud for the chaos of the secret life. The Golden Age was held together by a terrifyingly efficient fixer system. Men like Howard Strickling at MGM and Eddie Mannix were the industry's cleanup crew. Their job was to ensure that the private lives of the gods and goddesses never reached the ears of the public. This was the era of the contractual marriage, where the studio would arrange weddings between two stars to hide their true orientations or to suppress a brewing scandal. If a star was arrested for a DUI or found in a compromising position, the fixers would often arrive at the police station before the ink on the report was dry, using their immense financial leverage to make files disappear. This created a profound psychological rift for the actors. They were living in a panopticon where their every move was monitored by the very people who claimed to protect them. The pressure was immense. The legendary casting couch was not a myth but a systemic tool of power used by producers like Darryl F. Zanuck and Harry Cohn to remind performers of their place in the hierarchy. As we look at the legacy of these scandals and the brilliance of the design, we see the true double image of the Golden Age. It was a time of unparalleled artistic discipline and professional craftsmanship, built upon a foundation of ruthless human management. The Hollywood style was a masterclass in redirection, using the beauty of a silk gown and the flash of a smile to distract the world from the gritty industrial reality of the production line. By the time the studio system finally collapsed in the late 1960s, it left behind a world that was forever changed. We no longer looked at actors as mere humans, but as icons, vessels for our own collective desires and fears. The Golden Age taught us that the truth of a story isn't found in its facts, but in its aesthetic. It proved that if you light a scene correctly, dress the characters perfectly, and bury the scandals deeply enough, you can create a mythology that is more real than history itself. The dream factory may be gone, but the blueprints it left behind are still used every time a digital artist renders a sunset or a stylist chooses a dress for the red carpet. The Golden Age was the moment humanity finally mastered the art of the lie that tells a truth, a 40-year symphony of light and shadow that will continue to echo as long as there is a screen to catch the flicker of a dream. In this next movement, we pivot from the shadowed corridors of the studio lots to the bright, tragic, and fiercely resilient lives of the queens of the screen. This is the era of the female titan, where women like Bette Davis, Joan Crawford, and Marilyn Monroe had to navigate a system designed by men for men, while somehow carving out their own immortal legacies. To understand the Golden Age, one must understand that these women were not just stars, they were the primary currency of the industry. They were subjected to a level of scrutiny that would break most humans. Their weight, their marriages, and even the shape of their eyebrows were discussed in boardroom meetings as if they were industrial blueprints. Bette Davis, the fifth Warner brother, was the first to truly rebel. She famously sued Warner Brothers in 1936, challenging the slavery of the 7-year contract. Though she technically lost the legal battle, she won the war for artistic respect, forcing the studio to give her the complex, unlikable roles that would define her career. Davis proved that a woman didn't have to be a passive beauty to be a box-office powerhouse. She could be difficult, intelligent, and raw. Contrast her with Joan Crawford, the ultimate self-made myth. Crawford understood the machinery of Hollywood better than anyone. Born into poverty, she used the studio system to reinvent herself from a flapper into a sophisticated icon of high society drama. Crawford's career was a masterclass in survival. When MGM deemed her box office poison in the late 30s, she didn't fade away. Instead, she moved to Warner Brothers and fought for the title role in Mildred Pierce, winning an Oscar and proving that a woman's professional life didn't have to end at 40. This era was defined by the woman's picture, a genre that allowed for an exploration of female sacrifice and ambition, albeit within the confines of 1940s social norms. These films provided a mirror for millions of women who were entering the workforce during the war, offering them a version of themselves that was capable, flawed, and deeply human. Then there was the seismic arrival of Marilyn Monroe in the 1950s, the final and most complex icon of the Golden Age. Monroe was the intersection of every studio dream and every studio nightmare. She was the Technicolor goddess, who brought a soft, luminous vulnerability to the screen that was unlike anything seen before. Yet the tragedy of Monroe was the gap between the Marilyn the world saw and the Norma Jean, who struggled for intellectual recognition. She was the first star to successfully leverage the burgeoning power of television and the paparazzi to build a brand that existed independent of the studio, yet she remained trapped in the dumb blonde archetype created by men like Darryl F. Zanuck. Her death in 1962 remains the symbolic end of Hollywood's Age of Innocence, a reminder of the human cost of maintaining a 24-hour dream factory. These women were the true architects of the star image. They worked 100-hour weeks, endured painful cosmetic procedures, and lived their lives under the constant threat of being replaced by a younger version of themselves. Yet they managed to infuse their performances with a depth that transcended the scripts. They taught the world about the complexities of desire, the pain of aging in the public eye, and the power of a single perfectly lit close-up. As we look back on their lives, we see that the Golden Age was not just a period of technical achievement, but a crucible of female performance. The queens of the screen didn't just play characters, they created archetypes that still dominate our culture. From the working girl to the tragic diva, the templates established by Davis, Crawford, and Monroe are the foundations upon which every modern female celebrity is built. Their struggle for autonomy within the studio system was the first chapter of a much larger revolution, proving that while the studios owned their contracts, the audience's hearts belonged to the women themselves. In this next expansive movement of our epic narrative, we move from the front-facing glamour of the stars to the smoke-filled backrooms where the silent architects, the screenwriters, waged a war of words that would eventually topple the very system that fed them. To understand the Golden Age, one must recognize that while the moguls built the stages and the actors inhabited them, it was the writers who provided the soul, the wit, and the subversive subtext that allowed Hollywood to become the world's most powerful storytelling engine. In the early days, writers were treated as disposable ink-stained wretches, kept in rows of offices like office clerks. Yet these rooms contained the greatest literary minds of the century. F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner, and Raymond Chandler all sought refuge and a paycheck in Hollywood. This era gave rise to a unique form of literature. The screenplay, a blueprint of human emotion that had to be lean, rhythmic, and capable of bypassing the censors. Writers like Billy Wilder and Ben Hecht mastered the art of double entendre, crafting dialogue that sounded innocent to the Hays Code officials but was electric with sexual tension and social critique to the audience. Wilder, in particular, transitioned from a writer to a director-producer, proving that the man with the pen was ultimately the one with the power. His films, from Double Indemnity to Sunset Boulevard, were cynical, sharp, and deeply observant, stripping away the romanticized veneer of the industry to show the desperate, gritty reality underneath. However, the power of the word became a dangerous weapon during the late 1940s and 50s as the Cold War took hold of the American psyche. The screenwriters became the primary targets of the House Un-American Activities Committee (WAC), leading to the darkest chapter of the Golden Age, the blacklist. The Hollywood 10, a group of writers and directors who refused to answer questions about their political affiliations, were imprisoned and barred from the industry. Yet the resilience of the writers proved that you cannot kill an idea. Dalton Trumbo, perhaps the most famous blacklisted writer, continued to work under pseudonyms, winning 2 Academy Awards for scripts he didn't write, Roman Holiday and The Brave One. The secret was Hollywood's greatest irony. The studios were so desperate for high-quality storytelling that they knowingly hired the very subversives they had publicly banned. The breaking of the blacklist in 1960, when Kirk Douglas and Otto Preminger insisted on giving Trumbo screen credit for Spartacus and Exodus, marked the beginning of the end for the old studio hierarchy. It was a victory for the individual creator over the corporate machine. As the 1960s transitioned into the 70s, this newfound creative freedom birthed the auteur era, where the writer-director became the new god of the cinema. This transition was the bridge to the birth of the blockbuster. The children of the Golden Age, directors like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, took the technical precision and mythic storytelling they had learned from the old masters and infused it with a modern high-concept energy. In 1975, Spielberg's Jaws changed the industry forever, introducing the summer blockbuster and shifting the focus from year-round steady production to the event movie. 2 years later, Star Wars utilized the swashbuckling tropes of the 1930s to create a global phenomenon that proved the Golden Age sense of wonder was still the most profitable commodity in the world. The era of the studio mogul was officially replaced by the era of the franchise. The legacy of these silent architects is felt in every line of dialogue we quote today and every 3-act structure we see in modern streaming series. They taught us that a movie is only as good as its foundation. They survived censorship, imprisonment, and corporate greed to ensure that the Hollywood style remained the universal standard for human expression. As we look at the evolution from the typewriter to the digital script, we see a continuous thread of intellectual rebellion. The Golden Age ended when the writers and creators finally broke the chains of the contract system, but in doing so, they ensured that the dream factory would never stop evolving. The Golden Age wasn't just a time of beautiful faces. It was a time of brilliant minds who learned how to speak to the entire world at once, turning a commercial product into a lasting cultural heritage that defines the 20th century and beyond. In this next movement of our epic narrative, we descend into the shadows of the Golden Age to explore the cinematography of noir and the haunted geography of the town that built the dreams. While the 1930s were defined by high-key lighting and a sense of boundless optimism, the 1940s and 50s introduced a darker, more cynical visual language that reflected the collective trauma of a world at war. This was the era of film noir, a style that wasn't just a genre, but a psychological state captured on celluloid. The cinematographers of this era, many of whom were immigrants fleeing the rise of European fascism, brought with them the jagged, distorted aesthetics of German Expressionism. They turned the camera away from the sun and toward the alleyways. They mastered the use of chiaroscuro, the stark contrast between light and dark, to create a world where morality was as murky as the fog on a San Pedro pier. In a noir film, the light doesn't just illuminate, it hides. Venetian blinds cast jail cell shadows across the faces of doomed protagonists, and low-angle shots turn ordinary men into looming giants of greed and obsession. This was the first time Hollywood acknowledged that the American dream had a dark underbelly, and they used the very tools of the Dream Factory to expose it. This darkness on screen was mirrored by the real-world geography of Hollywood itself, a city that was becoming a graveyard of broken ambitions. To understand the Golden Age, one must walk the halls of its haunted locations. The Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, the site of the first Oscars, became a symbol of the industry's eternal ghosts. It is said that the spirit of Montgomery Clift still paces the halls where he once rehearsed his lines, and the image of Marilyn Monroe still flickers in the mirrors of the suites she frequented. Then there is the Hollywood sign itself, originally built as a Hollywoodland real estate advertisement, which became a tragic monument in 1932 when a young actress named Peg Entwistle, disillusioned by her lack of success in the talkies, leapt to her death from the letter H. These landmarks serve as reminders that for every star who found immortality, 1,000 others were swallowed by the machinery of the town. The city was a labyrinth of the lost, where the architecture of the studio's massive windowless soundstages acted as cathedrals where time didn't exist, and the only thing that mattered was the perfect take. As the Golden Age reached its final peak, the cinematography began to shift again, moving from the black and white shadows of noir into the saturated dreamlike technicolor noir of the late 50s and 60s. Films like Vertigo use color not for realism, but for psychological intensity, using greens and purples to signify obsession and the blurring of identity. This was the point where the Golden Age became self-aware, beginning to critique its own artifice. The lush melodramas of Douglas Sirk use vibrant colors to mask the hollow, decaying lives of suburban America, proving that the Hollywood style could be used to deconstruct the very myths it had created in the 30s. This mastery of the visual medium is the true legacy of the era. It taught us that how a story is told is just as important as what is being said. The shadow of a hat on a wall, the glint of a gun in the dark, the way a star's eyes catch a single pinpoint of light. These are the elements that turned movies into a modern mythology. We have now traveled from the orange groves of 1900 to the rain-slicked streets of the noir era and into the psychological colorscapes of the 60s. The Golden Age was a 40-year miracle of concentrated creative energy, a time when a small group of people in a California suburb redefined the human experience for the entire planet. It was a period of immense cruelty and immense beauty, of corporate tyranny and individual genius. But above all, it was a time of vision. As we conclude this epic journey, we realize that the Golden Age didn't just end, it simply became the air we breathe. Every time you watch a modern film and feel a sense of suspense, a surge of romance, or the thrill of an epic journey, you are feeling the echoes of the men and women who, a century ago, decided to chase the sun and capture it on a strip of silver. The Dream Factory is eternal because our need to dream is infinite. In this final, definitive movement of our epic journey, we move beyond the history books to explore the eternal afterlife of the Golden Age, how the blueprints of the 1930s and 40s created a digital immortality that dictates the very structure of modern entertainment and the psychology of global fame. To understand the conclusion of this era, one must look at the grammar of the soul that Hollywood perfected. Before the Golden Age, there was no universal agreement on how to tell a visual story. It was the studio system that standardized the continuous edit, the 3-act arc, and the shot-reverse shot dialogue sequence. These weren't just technical choices, they were discoveries in human biology, finding exactly how long the human eye wants to linger on a face before it needs to see the world around it. This is why a film from 1939 still feels right to a modern audience in 2026. The Golden Age masters cracked the code of human attention. The transition into the 21st century has seen the rise of post-human stardom. Today we use CGI to de-age actors or even bring them back from the dead to appear in new franchises. But the only reason this works is because the Golden Age created such powerful icons that their faces have become part of our collective DNA. When a modern director uses a Hitchcockian camera move or a Ford-esque wide shot, they are participating in a ritual that is nearly a century old. The Dream Factory has moved from the physical backlots of Burbank into the cloud, but the dreams themselves remain remarkably consistent. We still crave the hero's journey, the sophisticated wit of the screwball comedy, and the atmospheric dread of the noir thriller. The Golden Age taught us that cinema is the only art form that can simulate the experience of dreaming while awake, and that power has only intensified with the arrival of virtual reality and AI-driven storytelling. As we reach the finale of this 5,000 word per part epic, we must address the myth of the Golden Age. Was it truly golden? For the moguls it was a gold mine of profit. For the audiences it was a golden shield against the harsh realities of war and poverty. But for the laborers, the women, and the minorities who were often marginalized or erased from the screen, it was an era of struggle and gilded bondage. The new Hollywood that rose from its ashes was a necessary correction, a move toward truth, diversity, and raw honesty. However, even the most cynical modern filmmaker looks back at the 1940s with a sense of technicolor envy. There was a deliberate handcrafted beauty in those films. The way the silver nitrate in the film stock made the star's skin look like it was glowing from within, that digital sensors struggled to replicate. The Golden Age ended when the gates of the major studios were thrown open and the stars became freelancers, but its ghost remains the most powerful force in the industry. Every time a blockbuster captures the world's imagination, it is using the tools forged by the Warner Brothers, the aesthetics designed by Edith Head, and the narrative pacing perfected by the blacklisted writers of the 50s. We are all citizens of the world that Hollywood built. It is a world where the sun never sets on the British Empire of the screen, where the happy ending is a universal right, and where, for the price of a ticket, anyone can become a god for 2 hours. Our journey through this history is a reminder that while the film stock may decay and the actors may pass away, the light, that flickering, intentional, beautiful light, is permanent. It is the fire that the 20th century stole from the heavens to tell its story, and as long as there is a story left to tell, the Golden Age will never truly end. If the Golden Age of Hollywood was about capturing the light, the space race was about conquering the darkness. This was a narrative written not by screenwriters, but by physicists and spies, performed on a stage 250,000 miles wide. It began as a grim byproduct of World War II, a desperate scavenge for the V-2 rocket technology of Nazi Germany. In the ruins of the 1940s, both the United States and the Soviet Union realized that the same power required to launch a bomb across an ocean was the key to reaching the stars. The starting pistol, Sputnik, and the Great Anxiety. The decade of the 1950s, the very same era when Hollywood was fighting the widescreen wars, witnessed a sudden terrifying beat from the heavens. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1. It was a polished metal sphere no larger than a beach ball, but it changed the world overnight. For the first time in human history, the high ground of space was occupied, and it wasn't occupied by the West. The Sputnik shock. Americans, used to being the masters of technology, looked up to see a Soviet satellite passing overhead every 96 minutes. It was a PR disaster that no Hollywood studio could spin. The Vanguard failure. The U.S. response, the Vanguard rocket, exploded on national television just feet off the launch pad. The press dubbed it Stay Putnik and Flop Nick. The birth of NASA. In 1958, out of the ashes of this public humiliation, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was born. The mission was no longer just about defense, it was about the survival of the American image. The first Earthlings in the dark. Before humans could go, the pioneers were the voiceless. The Soviets chose stray dogs from the streets of Moscow, believing their survival on the freezing streets made them resilient. In November 1957, Laika became the first living creature to orbit the Earth aboard Sputnik 2. She was a passenger on a one-way trip, a tragic pioneer who proved that life could survive the launch and the weightlessness of orbit. The Americans, meanwhile, looked to our closest relatives. They launched Hem the Astrochimp in 1961. Unlike the passive Soviet dogs, Hem had to perform tasks, pulling levers to prove that a brain could still function under the crushing pressure of G-forces. When Ham returned safely, grinning for the cameras, the path was clear. The ultimate leading man, Yuri Gagarin. On April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union delivered the ultimate sequel to Sputnik. Yuri Gagarin, a pilot with a charismatic smile that rivaled any Hollywood star, became the first human to leave the planet. Inside the tiny Vostok 1 capsule, he uttered the words, "Poyekali. Let's go," and ascended into the history books. He didn't just orbit the Earth, he broke the psychological barrier of what it meant to be human. I see Earth. It is so beautiful. Yuri Gagarin, 1961. Hollywood had spent decades simulating alien worlds on soundstages, but Gagarin had actually seen the blackness of the cosmos. The United States was now behind in every meaningful metric. The space race was no longer a hobby for scientists, it was a total war of ideologies. By the spring of 1961, the United States was bruised. Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight had proven that the Soviets weren't just winning, they were dominating the narrative of human progress. In response, John F. Kennedy did something that would have seemed like science fiction just years prior. On May 25, 1961, he stood before a joint session of Congress and issued a challenge that felt like a line from a big-budget Hollywood epic. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. This wasn't just a policy goal, it was an act of extreme political gambling. At the time of this speech, the U.S. had exactly 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. Project Mercury, the seven samurai of the sky. To answer Kennedy's call, NASA turned to Project Mercury. Their mission was simple but terrifying. Put a human in a capsule, strap that capsule to a modified intercontinental ballistic missile (ICBM), and see if they could survive. The Mercury 7 astronauts became the first true rock stars of the technological age. They were test pilots, men with the right stuff who possessed a unique blend of icy nerves and technical brilliance. Alan Shepard, Freedom 7. On May 5, 1961, Shepard became the first American in space. It was a suborbital lob, a 15-minute arc into the blackness and back, but it proved that an American could handle the G-forces and the weightlessness. John Glenn, Friendship 7. The real turning point came in February 1962. John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. For nearly 5 hours, Glenn circled the globe, seeing 4 sunsets in a single day. But the mission almost ended in disaster. A faulty sensor suggested his heat shield was loose. Glenn had to re-enter the atmosphere manually, wondering if he would incinerate upon impact. He splashed down a hero, and the U.S. was finally truly in the race. The Rice University Manifesto. As the sheer cost and difficulty of the moonshot began to draw criticism, Kennedy doubled down. In September 1962 at Rice University, he delivered the speech that would define the era's philosophy. He didn't promise it would be easy, he promised it would be hard. We choose to go to the moon, not because they are easy but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. The engineering nightmare. Behind the speeches, NASA engineers were facing a reality check. To get to the moon, they couldn't just use Mercury's one-man-in-a-can approach. They needed to solve 3 impossible problems. Rendezvous. How do 2 ships find each other in the vastness of space and dock? Duration. How does a human body survive a 2-week trip in a vacuum? EVA. How does a human step out of a spacecraft and actually work in the void? To solve these, NASA launched Project Gemini, the bridge to the moon. If Mercury was about proving we could get there, Gemini was about proving we could stay there and maneuver there. If Mercury was about proving a human could survive the lob into space, Project Gemini, 1965 to 1966, was the specialized laboratory where NASA learned the actual tradecraft of the moonshot. Named after the Latin for twins, the Gemini capsule held 2 astronauts and was far more maneuverable than the Mercury Belle. The Spacewalker, Ed White's $1 million float. The most cinematic moment of this era occurred on June 3, 1965 during Gemini 4. Ed White opened the hatch and drifted out into the void, becoming the first American to walk in space. Tethered by a gold-plated umbilical cord and clutching a zip gun to propel himself, White floated over the turquoise Earth for 23 minutes. "I feel like $1 million," White radioed back. He enjoyed the experience so much that when Mission Control ordered him back inside, he sighed, "It's the saddest moment of my life." The Gemini grind, docking and endurance. The rest of Gemini was a relentless checklist of firsts required for Apollo. Gemini 6 and 7 conducted the first space rendezvous, bringing two ships within inches of each other while moving at 17,500 miles per hour. Gemini 8, Neil Armstrong performed the first docking with another vessel. However, a thruster malfunctioned, sending the ship into a terrifying roll. Armstrong used his icy test pilot nerves to stabilize the craft, a feat that would later help secure his seat on Apollo 11. Gemini 7. Astronauts spent 14 days in a cockpit the size of a phone booth, proving that humans could survive the long transit time to the moon. The trial by fire, the tragedy of Apollo 1. By 1967, NASA was feeling invincible. Gemini was a resounding success, and the first Apollo mission, Apollo 1, was scheduled for February. The crew consisted of Mercury veteran Gus Grissom, spacewalker Ed White, and rookie Roger Chaffee. On January 27, 1967, the crew was inside the command module for a plugs-out test on the launch pad. The cabin was pressurized with 100% pure oxygen, a choice made for simplicity but one that turned the capsule into a tinderbox. At 6:31 p.m., a spark, likely from a frayed wire, ignited the cabin. In the pure oxygen environment, the fire became an inferno in seconds. The inward opening hatch, held shut by the internal pressure of the fire's heat, was impossible for the astronauts to open in time. Within 17 seconds of the first report of fire, all three men were gone. The phoenix from the ashes. The disaster halted the program and shattered the nation's confidence. But NASA didn't quit. They entered a period of brutal introspection. Led by Flight Director Gene Kranz, who famously declared that his team would henceforth be tough and competent, NASA redesigned everything. The pure oxygen was replaced by a safer nitrogen-oxygen mix during launch. The inward opening hatch was replaced by a unified outward opening hatch that could be opened in 5 seconds. Flammable materials like Velcro were removed or replaced. The sacrifice of the Apollo 1 crew didn't end the moonshot. It ensured that when the next men climbed into that capsule, they would be riding the safest, most scrutinized machine in human history. To get to the moon, NASA needed more than just nerves. It needed the Saturn V. Designed by Wernher von Braun, this rocket remains the tallest, heaviest, and most powerful machine ever to reach operational status. Standing 363 feet tall, roughly the height of a 36-story building, it generated 7.6 million pounds of thrust. When it launched, the sound waves were so intense they could be felt miles away, shattering windows and rattling the bones of spectators. It was less a vehicle and more a controlled explosion. Apollo 8, the ultimate Christmas gift. As 1968 drew to a close, the United States was a nation in turmoil. The Vietnam War was raging, and the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy had left the public psyche wounded. NASA decided on a bold, risky move. They would send the next Apollo mission all the way to the moon, not to land but to orbit. On December 21, 1968, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders climbed atop the Saturn V. They were the first humans to ever see the dark side of the moon, a desolate, cratered landscape that had been hidden from human eyes since the beginning of time. Earthrise, a shift in consciousness. As the capsule emerged from behind the moon, the crew witnessed something no human had ever seen: the Earth rising over the lunar horizon. "Oh my God! Look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty?" Bill Anders. Anders snapped a photograph that would become known as Earthrise. It showed our planet as a fragile, vibrant blue marble suspended in a vast, indifferent blackness. In a year defined by division and war, this single image provided a moment of global unity. It was the first time humanity truly understood that we are all passengers on a single, lonely spaceship. The Christmas Eve broadcast. On Christmas Eve 1968, while in lunar orbit, the crew addressed the world. In the most-watched television broadcast in history at that time, they took turns reading the opening verses of Genesis. As the camera showed the barren lunar surface passing below, the contrast between the dead moon and the living Earth was profound. They ended the broadcast with Borman's famous sign-off. And from the crew of Apollo 8 we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth. Apollo 8 was the dress rehearsal that proved everything worked. The navigation, the life support, and the communication across 240,000 miles of vacuum. The stage was finally set for the climax of the decade. The moon was no longer a distant light in the sky, it was a destination. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V roared to life one more time. Inside the command module Columbia sat Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Their destination was a specific flat patch of lunar basalt known as the Sea of Tranquility. The final descent, alarms in the dark. 4 days later, the mission split in two. Collins remained in orbit, the loneliest man in history, while Armstrong and Aldrin descended in the lunar module Eagle. This was the most dangerous phase of the entire program. As they dropped toward the surface, the onboard computer, a machine with less processing power than a modern toaster, began to scream. The 12:02 alarm, a program alarm, flashed on the console. For a few heart-stopping seconds, Mission Control in Houston had to decide, abort or go. A 26-year-old controller named Steve Bales realized the computer was just overwhelmed, not failing. He called out, "We're go on that alarm." The boulder field. As they neared the ground, Armstrong looked out the window and saw they were heading straight for a massive crater filled with car-sized boulders. With less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining, Armstrong took manual control. He hovered the Eagle like a helicopter, kicking up a blinding curtain of lunar dust, searching for a clear spot. In Houston, the room was silent. Flight Director Gene Kranz later recalled that the controllers were holding their breath until they were turning blue. At 2017 Universal Time Coordinated, the contact light flickered. Armstrong's voice crackled across the void. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." One giant leap. 6 hours later, a grainier-than-expected television feed reached 650 million people, 1/5 of the world's population at the time. Neil Armstrong climbed down the 9-rung ladder. He reached the bottom, paused, and placed his left boot into the fine silty soil of another world. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Buzz Aldrin followed shortly after, describing the landscape as magnificent desolation. For 2.5 hours they collected rocks, set up experiments, and planted a flag reinforced with a wire rod so it would look like it was waving in a vacuum where no wind blows. The legacy of the race. The Apollo 11 mission was the series finale of the 1960s space race. While 5 more missions would land on the moon, with the exception of the successful failure of Apollo 13, the primary geopolitical goal had been achieved. The United States had fulfilled Kennedy's challenge. The space race changed the world in ways that weren't just about flags and footprints. Technological acceleration. It birthed the integrated circuit which led to the computer revolution and the smartphone in your pocket. Environmental awakening. The Earthrise and blue marble photos launched the modern environmental movement. Global identity. For a brief moment, humanity didn't identify by nation, but by species. As the Apollo program ended in 1972, the high noon of space exploration transitioned into the era of the Space Shuttle, the International Space Station, and today's private race to Mars. We proved that with enough collective will, the impossible is simply a problem that hasn't been solved yet. If the space race was a sprint to the heavens, the Roman Empire was a marathon that lasted over a millennium. It was the original dream factory, but instead of films it produced laws, roads, and a brand of civilization so potent that its echoes still dictate how we build cities, fight wars, and govern people today. The foundation, from mud to marble. Rome didn't start as an empire. It started as a gritty, backwater settlement on 7 hills in central Italy. Legend says it was founded by Romulus and Remus, twins raised by a wolf, a fittingly violent origin for a culture that would eventually prize strength above all else. But the true genius of Rome wasn't just in its swords, it was in its citizenship. Unlike the exclusive Greeks, the Romans were masters of assimilation. When they conquered a neighbor, they didn't just enslave them, they eventually invited them to be Roman. This turned an ethnic city-state into a multinational corporation of the ancient world. The Republic, a balancing act of power. Before the emperors, there was the Republic. This was a complex, fragile machine of checks and balances that would later inspire the founding fathers of the United States. The Senate, a body of elder statesmen who held the purse strings and the prestige. The consuls, two men elected for one-year terms to lead the army, a system designed to ensure no single person could become a king. The SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. This was the brand, the logo stamped on every legionary shield and every public building. The Punic Wars, the superpower threshold. The moment Rome transitioned from a regional power to a global titan was during the Punic Wars against Carthage, based in modern-day Tunisia. This was the World War of Antiquity. Hannibal's Gambit. The Carthaginian general Hannibal famously led war elephants over the Alps to strike at Rome's heart. He won every battle but could not win the war because the Roman will was unbreakable. Total destruction. By 146 BC, Rome didn't just defeat Carthage. They allegedly salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, what they called Mare Nostrum, our sea. The internal rot. But as the borders expanded, the Republic began to buckle under its own weight. Wealth from the conquests flowed to the top 1%, creating a massive class of landless poor. The citizen soldiers who once fought for the state began to fight for generals who promised them land and retirement. This shift, from loyalty to the Constitution to loyalty to the individual, set the stage for the most famous star in Roman history, Julius Caesar. By the middle of the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic was a high-performance engine running on contaminated fuel. The wealth of an entire world was pouring into Rome, but it was creating a toxic disparity. The streets were crowded with veterans who had conquered the world but owned no land. Into this chaos stepped Gaius Julius Caesar, a man who combined the tactical genius of a general with the populist charisma of a movie star. The First Triumvirate, a shaky alliance. To grasp Caesar's rise, you have to understand the three-headed monster. Caesar formed an uneasy alliance with the two most powerful men in Rome. Crassus, the richest man in history, who allegedly tried to buy military glory. Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general and a darling of the traditionalists. Together, they bypassed the Senate and ran Rome like a private boardroom. But alliances built on ambition are built on sand. When Crassus died in a botched invasion and Caesar went off to spend 8 years conquering Gaul, modern France, the bond snapped. The Gallic Wars, the greatest PR campaign. While Caesar was slaughtering and enslaving millions in Gaul, he wasn't just fighting, he was writing. He sent back regular dispatches, the Gallic Wars, written in the third person, making his victories sound like inevitable acts of destiny. He was building his brand while building his army. By 50 BC he was the most famous man in the world, and his legions were more loyal to him than to the Roman state. Crossing the Rubicon, the point of no return. The Senate, terrified of Caesar's power, sided with Pompey and ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome to face trial for war crimes. Caesar knew that returning alone meant political suicide. On the night of January 10, 49 BC, Caesar stood at the banks of the Rubicon, a small river that marked the boundary between his province and Italy. To cross it with an army was an act of high treason, a declaration of civil war. Legend says he hesitated, then uttered the famous line, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. He didn't just cross a river, he stepped over the threshold of a 1,000-year tradition. The Republic was effectively dead the moment his horses' hooves hit the southern bank. The dictator for life and the Ides of March. Caesar chased Pompey across the Mediterranean, defeated him in Greece, and spent a romantic and strategic interlude with Cleopatra in Egypt. He returned to Rome as the undisputed master. He wasn't a king, Rome hated kings, but he accepted the title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. He began sweeping reforms. He fixed the calendar, the Julian calendar we still largely use. gave land to veterans and expanded the Senate. But his arrogance was his undoing. On March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March, a group of 60 senators including his protégé Brutus, cornered him at a meeting. They believed that by killing the man, they could save the Republic. They stabbed him 23 times. Caesar died at the foot of a statue of his old rival, Pompey. The fatal miscalculation. The conspirators walked out into the streets shouting "Liberty!" expecting the public to celebrate. Instead, they found a city paralyzed with horror. They had killed the dictator, but they hadn't realized that the Republic was already a corpse. The power vacuum left by Caesar's blood on the floor didn't lead back to democracy. It led to an even bloodier civil war that would eventually birth the first true emperor. After the Ides of March, Rome didn't find liberty. It found a teenage nightmare. Julius Caesar will named his grandnephew Octavian as his primary heir. At 18, Octavian was sickly and lacked military experience, but he possessed a chilling political IQ. He understood something the Senate didn't. The Roman people no longer cared about republic or freedom if it meant constant civil war and starvation. They wanted order. The Second Triumvirate and the end of the West. Octavian formed a brutal alliance with Caesar's top general, Mark Antony, and a wealthy middleman named Lepidus. Their first act was to purge the city. They posted lists of proscribed enemies. Thousands were hunted down and killed, including the great orator Cicero, whose head and hands were nailed to the Senate rostrum as a warning. But the world was too small for two giants. The empire split. Mark Antony took the wealthy, exotic East, where he fell into a legendary and politically disastrous alliance with Cleopatra. Octavian stayed in Rome, masterfully branding himself as the defender of traditional Roman values against an Eastern, decadent Antony. The climax came in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium, a massive naval clash off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet crushed Antony and Cleopatra's. The lovers fled to Egypt and took their own lives, leaving the 33-year-old Octavian as the sole master of the Mediterranean world. The Great Illusion, the Principate. Octavian was smarter than his great-uncle. He knew that if he called himself king or dictator, he would end up with 23 knife wounds. Instead, he staged a brilliant political performance. He walked into the Senate and resigned all his emergency powers, handing the state back to the people. The terrified, exhausted Senate begged him to stay. They gave him a new title, Augustus the Illustrious One. He called himself Princeps, the first citizen. It was a masterpiece of branding. On the surface, the Republic was restored. In reality, Augustus controlled the army, the treasury, and the grain supply. He was an emperor in a business suit. The Pax Romana, peace through superior firepower. This was the beginning of the Pax Romana, a 200-year span of relative stability. Augustus realized that a stable empire needed more than just soldiers, it needed infrastructure. He famously bragged, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." He created the first permanent police force, the first fire brigade, and a massive postal system. He settled hundreds of thousands of veterans on land across the empire, turning them from potential rebels into loyal middle-class farmers. This was the golden age of Roman literature. The era of Virgil's Aeneid, written to give the Roman people a mythic divine origin story that justified their rule over the world. The moral police. Augustus also tried to legislate Roman morality. He passed laws penalizing adultery and rewarding families with 3 or more children. He wanted to return to a pure Rome that probably never existed. But even the emperor couldn't control everything. He eventually had to exile his own daughter Julia for the very scandalous behavior he had outlawed. When Augustus died in 14 AD, he had ruled for 40 years. He had turned a chaotic, blood-soaked city-state into a professional, bureaucratic global empire. On his deathbed, he supposedly asked his friends, "Have I played the part well? If so, applaud me as I exit." The tragedy of the Roman Empire was that while Augustus could build a perfect bureaucracy, he couldn't build a perfect son. The problem of succession would haunt Rome for centuries. Since there was no formal law on how to pass power, it became a game of poison, daggers, and backroom deals. Tiberius, the recluse of Capri. Augustus was succeeded by his stepson, Tiberius. A brilliant general but a miserable man, Tiberius hated the political theater of Rome. He eventually retreated to the island of Capri, leaving the empire to be run by his ruthless advisor Sejanus. While the machinery of the state continued to hum efficiently, proving Augustus had built it well, the heart of the government became a place of paranoia. Tiberius lived in a villa on a cliff, allegedly throwing those who displeased him into the sea. This was the era where the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite bodyguards, realized they were the true kingmakers. Caligula, the living god. When Tiberius died, the world cheered for the young Gaius, nicknamed Caligula, Little Boots. But after a near-fatal illness, Caligula's mind seemed to fracture. He declared himself a living god, ordered statues of himself to be placed in temples, and famously threatened to make his horse Incitatus a consul. The war on the ocean. He once marched his legions to the English Channel and instead of invading Britain, ordered them to attack the waves and gather seashells as spoils of the sea. The final act. In 41 AD, his own Praetorian Guard realized he was a liability and stabbed him to death in a palace corridor. Claudius, the unexpected scholar. In the chaos of Caligula's murder, the guards found a middle-aged man hiding behind a curtain, trembling for his life. This was Claudius, Caligula's uncle. Because he had a limp and a stutter, the family had always dismissed him as a fool. The guards hailed him as emperor, thinking he would be easy to control. They were wrong. Claudius was a brilliant historian who proved to be one of Rome's most capable administrators. He oversaw the conquest of Britain, built the great harbor at Ostia, and centralized the bureaucracy. But his downfall was his family. His wife, Agrippina the Younger, allegedly poisoned him with a dish of mushrooms so her son from a previous marriage could take the throne. Nero, the artist who burned the stage. That son was Nero. At first, guided by the philosopher Seneca, Nero's reign was peaceful. But soon his narcissism took over. He considered himself a world-class poet, chariot racer and singer, forcing the elite of Rome to sit through his hours-long performances. The defining moment of his reign was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. While legend says he fiddled while Rome burned, the fiddle didn't exist yet, he did use the cleared land to build a massive golden house for himself. To deflect blame, he targeted a small fringe religious sect for the arson, the Christians. This marked the first state-sponsored persecution of the church. Eventually, the Senate declared him a public enemy. As the guards closed in, Nero took his own life, famously whispering, "Qualis artifex perio? What an artist dies with me." The year of the four emperors. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian line ended. In a single year, 69 AD, four different generals claimed the throne in a brutal civil war. The mask of Republican restoration was gone. The world now knew the secret of empire, that an emperor could be made in the provinces by the power of the legions, not just in Rome by the Senate. Out of the smoke of the civil wars of 69 AD emerged Vespasian, a gritty no-nonsense general who started the Flavian dynasty. He knew that to stabilize Rome, he had to distract the restless masses and wash away the memory of Nero's decadence. His solution was the ultimate gift to the Roman people, the Flavian amphitheater better known as the Colosseum. The Colosseum, blood and sand. Built on the site of Nero's private lake, the Colosseum was a political statement. It took the land stolen by a tyrant and gave it back to the public for entertainment. It was a marvel of ancient engineering. The spectacle, it could hold 50,000 to 80,000 spectators who were seated by social class. The machinery. Below the floor was the hypogeum, a complex network of tunnels and elevators used to pop lions, gladiators and scenery through trapdoors to surprise the crowd. The bread and circuses. This was the social media of the Roman world, a place where the emperor could gauge the public mood and provide the bread and circuses, panem et circenses, that kept the population from revolting. The wrath of nature, Pompeii. During the reign of Vespasian's son, Titus, the empire faced one of history's most famous disasters. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying the resort towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum in meters of volcanic ash. While a tragedy, the eruption acted as a time capsule, preserving the daily life of Romans, from their graffiti and fast food stalls to their intricate mosaic floors, providing modern historians with an intimate look at a civilization frozen in a single afternoon. The Five Good Emperors, the zenith. The Flavian line eventually gave way to the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, a period historians call the Five Good Emperors. This was the peak of the Pax Romana, where succession was handled by adoption based on merit rather than birth. Trajan, the conqueror under Trajan, the empire reached its maximum territorial extent, 117 AD. From the rain-swept hills of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia, Rome ruled over roughly 5 million square kilometers and nearly 20% of the world's population. Hadrian, the builder Trajan's successor, realized the empire was too big to grow further. He spent his reign traveling the provinces and consolidating power. He built Hadrian's Wall in northern England to mark the edge of the civilized world and reconstructed the Pantheon in Rome, featuring a concrete dome that is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. The era closed with Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. He spent most of his reign on the frozen frontiers, fighting off Germanic tribes, yet he spent his nights writing his Meditations, a masterpiece of Stoic philosophy on how to remain virtuous while wielding absolute power. He was the last of the good emperors, and his death in 180 AD marked the end of the long summer of the Pax Romana. As the sun began to set on this golden era, the pressures on the borders were growing, the economy was beginning to stagnate, and the adoptive system of succession was about to be abandoned for a far more dangerous path. The collapse began with a transition from the philosopher to the fighter. When Marcus Aurelius died, he broke the adoptive tradition by leaving the throne to his biological son, Commodus, the villain of gladiator fame. Commodus was more interested in fighting as a gladiator than governing, and his assassination in 192 AD triggered a century where the empire became a high-stakes game of musical chairs played with swords. The Barracks Emperors. For 50 years, the title of emperor was bought and sold by the legions. There were over 26 legitimate emperors and dozens of pretenders in this span. Most reigned for less than 2 years before being murdered by their own troops. This was the barracks era, where the only qualification for leadership was the ability to pay the soldiers a higher bonus than the last guy. The triple threat: plague, economy, and invasion. Rome was hit by a perfect storm that would have leveled any other civilization. The Cyprian Plague, a devastating pandemic, swept through the empire, killing thousands daily and hollowing out the tax base and the military. Hyperinflation. To pay the army, emperors debased the currency, mixing silver coins with cheap copper. By the end of the century, the Roman denarius was virtually worthless, and the economy regressed into a barter system. The breakaway empires. The strain was so great that the empire actually split into three. The Gallic Empire broke away in the west, and the Palmyrene Empire, led by the formidable Queen Zenobia, took the east. For a moment, Rome was just a small strip of land in the middle. Diocletian, the Great Reboot. In 284 AD, a tough-as-nails commander named Diocletian seized power. He realized the empire was too massive for one man to govern. His solution was radical: the Tetrarchy, rule of 4. He split the empire into east and west. Each half had a senior emperor, Augustus, and a junior emperor, Caesar. Diocletian also moved the capital away from Rome to more strategic locations like Nicomedia and Milan. Rome remained the spiritual heart, but it was no longer the political brain. He stabilized the economy with price controls and professionalized the bureaucracy. He was the first emperor to wear a diadem and demand people prostrate themselves, transitioning the role from first citizen to lord and master, dominus. The last great persecution. In an attempt to unify the fractured people under traditional Roman identity, Diocletian launched the Great Persecution of Christians. It was the most systematic attempt to wipe out the faith, but it backfired. The stoicism of the martyrs only drew more converts to the religion, setting the stage for the most significant cultural shift in Western history. Diocletian did something no other emperor had done: he retired. He went to his palace in Split, modern-day Croatia, to grow cabbages. But his four-man system relied on his personal authority, and as soon as he stepped down, the junior emperors drew their swords. After Diocletian retired to his cabbage patch, his rule of four collapsed into a bloody game of last man standing. By 312 AD, the competition had narrowed down to two men: Maxentius, who held Rome, and Constantine, who was marching down from Britain and Gaul. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge. On the eve of the battle that would decide the fate of the world, legend says Constantine looked up at the sun and saw a vision, a cross of light with the Greek words en teutonica, in this sign conquer. He ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi, the first two letters of Christ's name, on their shields. Constantine won a crushing victory. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine entered Rome not just as a conqueror, but as the protector of a once-hated sect. In 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious tolerance to Christians. He wasn't just being pious, he was being practical. He saw that Christianity was a disciplined, organized network that could provide the social glue a fractured empire desperately needed. The Council of Nicaea, standardizing the faith. Constantine realized that if his new state religion was divided by internal squabbles, it would be useless. In 325 AD, he summoned bishops from across the world to the Council of Nicaea. He sat among them, not as a theologian but as a chairman. They hammered out the Nicene Creed, establishing a unified doctrine. For the first time, the Church and the state were fused into a single powerful engine of authority. Constantinople, the new Rome. Constantine knew that the city of Rome was too weighed down by pagan ghosts and stubborn senators. He looked to the east, to the strategic gateway between Europe and Asia. There, on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, he built Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. Strategic genius. The city was surrounded on three sides by water and protected by massive walls. The new center of gravity, he moved the capital, the elite, and the wealth of the empire to this new Rome. This move ensured the empire would survive for another 1,000 years in the east, even as the west began to wither. The irony of success. By the time Constantine died in 337 AD, he had fundamentally altered the DNA of the empire. The emperor was no longer just a general, he was God's representative on earth. But by moving the capital to the east, Constantine had inadvertently left the western half of the empire, the original heart of Rome, exposed. The wealth was in the east. The best troops were in the east. The west was left with dwindling taxes, crumbling infrastructure, and a growing tide of Germanic tribes who were no longer just raiding the borders. They were looking for a place to call home. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was officially a house divided. The eastern half, governed from the gleaming towers of Constantinople, was rich and defensible. The western half, governed from Milan and later the swampy fortress of Ravenna, was struggling to pay its bills. The Great Migration, the walls break. The end didn't start with an invasion of barbarians looking to destroy Rome. It started with refugees looking for safety. A terrifying new force had appeared on the steppes of Asia: the Huns. These nomadic horse archers pushed the Germanic tribes, the Goths, Vandals, and Franks, westward. In 376 AD, the Visigoths begged for entry into the empire. Rome, in a moment of staggering mismanagement, let them in but mistreated them so badly that the refugees turned into rebels. At the Battle of Adrianople, 378 AD, the Goths destroyed a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens. The myth of Roman invincibility was dead. 410 AD, the unthinkable occurs. For 800 years, no foreign enemy had set foot inside the city of Rome. That changed when Alaric, the leader of the Visigoths, besieged the city. In 410 AD, the gates were opened from the within, and the Goths spent 3 days looting the eternal city. My voice sticks in my throat. The city which has taken the whole world is itself taken. St. Jerome. While the damage was limited compared to later sacks, the psychological impact was a seismic shift. If Rome could fall, was anything permanent? Attila, the scourge of God. Just as Rome tried to stabilize, the Huns arrived. Attila, their charismatic and brutal leader, forged a massive empire that stretched from Germany to the Caspian Sea. He blackmailed the Eastern Empire for thousands of pounds of gold and turned his sights on the West. In 451 AD, a last coalition of Romans and Visigoths managed to halt Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. It was the last great victory of the Western Roman army, but it was a Pyrrhic one. The West had used up its remaining strength to survive. 476 AD, the quiet ending. The end of the Western Empire wasn't a cinematic battle, it was a bureaucratic dismissal. By 476 AD, the Roman emperor was a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, combining the names of the founder and the first emperor. He was a puppet of the Germanic generals who now made up the bulk of the Roman army. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer finally decided he didn't need a puppet. He forced Romulus to abdicate and sent the imperial regalia, the crown and robes, to Constantinople, essentially saying, "We don't need an emperor in the West anymore. We'll take it from here." In the West, the 5th and 6th centuries are often called the Dark Ages. Literacy plummeted, roads crumbled, and the complex trade networks of the Mediterranean snapped. But in Constantinople, the Roman flame was a bonfire. The people there didn't call themselves Byzantines, that's a term historians invented later. They called themselves Romaeoi, Romans. They spoke Greek, but they lived under Roman law and defended the Roman dream. Justinian and the dream of reconquest. In 527 AD, Justinian I took the throne with one singular obsessive goal: Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire. He wanted the West back. The general, he tasked his brilliant commander Belisarius with recapturing the lost provinces. In a series of lightning campaigns, Belisarius retook North Africa, Italy, and even the city of Rome itself. The law. Justinian realized that an empire is held together by more than swords. He compiled the Corpus Juris Civilis, a massive distillation of 1,000 years of Roman law. This code is the foundation upon which almost all modern European legal systems are built. The Hagia Sophia, heaven on earth. To prove that Constantinople was the true center of the world, Justinian built the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. When it was completed in 537 AD, its massive dome seemed to float on a ring of light, a feat of engineering that defied the physics of the time. Upon entering, Justinian supposedly cried out, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee!" The invisible enemy, the plague. Just as Justinian was on the verge of reuniting the old empire, nature intervened. The plague of Justinian, the first recorded bubonic plague pandemic, struck in 541 AD. It killed nearly 25% of the empire's population, including many of its best soldiers. The tax base vanished, the reconquest stalled, and the West was eventually abandoned once more. Rome would never be unified again. Greek fire, the secret weapon. As the centuries rolled on, the Byzantine Empire became the shield of Christendom, holding back waves of invasions from the Persians and later the rising caliphates of Islam. Their secret was Greek fire, a terrifying, liquid incendiary weapon that could burn on water. The formula was a state secret so guarded that it has been lost to history. The Great Schism. The gap between the New Rome in the East and the Old Rome in the West eventually became cultural and religious. In 1054 AD, the Great Schism split the Church into the Roman Catholic West and the Eastern Orthodox East. They were no longer brothers, they were rivals. The Byzantine Empire would endure for another 400 years after this split, acting as the librarian of the ancient world, preserving the works of Plato, Aristotle, and the Roman poets while the West slowly rediscovered them through the Crusades and the Renaissance. By the 15th century, the Roman Empire had shrunk to a single city, Constantinople. Surrounded by the rising Ottoman Empire, the city was a majestic relic, its massive Theodosian walls still standing as the last line of defense for a 1,500-year-old dream. 1453, the walls come down. The end came not from a sword but from gunpowder. Mehmed the Conqueror, the Ottoman Sultan, brought massive cannons, monsters of bronze that could fire 600-pound stones, to batter the ancient Roman walls. On May 29, 1453, the city fell. The last emperor, Constantine XI, reportedly cast off his imperial regalia and died fighting in the streets like a common soldier. The Roman Empire as a political entity was over. The Renaissance, the Roman reboot. However, the fall of Constantinople triggered a cultural Big Bang. Scholars fled the city, carrying ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts to Italy. This influx of lost knowledge ignited the Renaissance. Suddenly, Europe was obsessed with Roman architecture, Roman law, and Roman philosophy. They didn't just want to study Rome, they wanted to be Rome. The modern Roman world. We often speak of Rome in the past tense, but look around you, the Roman Empire never truly died, it just changed medium. Language. If you speak Spanish, French, Italian, or Portuguese, you are speaking modern Latin. Even 60% of English words have Latin roots. Architecture. From the U.S. Capitol to the smallest courthouse in a rural town, the classical style, domes, columns, and arches, remains the visual language of authority. The calendar and law. We still use the Julian/Gregorian calendar. The concept of innocent until proven guilty and the right to a trial are direct imports from the Roman Forum. The idea of the state. The very concept of a republic, from residential publica, the public affair, is the Roman gift to modern democracy. The eternal warning. The legacy of Rome is also a warning. The story of its collapse, the overextension of its military, the widening gap between the ultra-rich and the poor, the debasement of currency, and the erosion of civic norms, remains the primary case study for every modern nation. Rome taught us that a civilization is not destroyed by its enemies from without, but by the loss of its internal glue. As we close this epic, we see that the golden age of Hollywood, the space race, and the Roman Empire are all part of the same human story. The drive to build something that outlasts the individual. The Romans called it imperium sine fine, empire without end. In the laws we follow, the languages we speak, and the way we dream of greatness, that empire is still alive today.